Oh, it's hit. Oh, okay. Well, that means we are live right here in Rocket City Podcast. How you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing real well.
Glad that you are here. This is my buddy Nathan Sheehan. We are going to have a little bit of a conversation. You came to me with an interesting topic, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But first, we want to know a little bit about you. So where are you from, Nathan?
I was born in Baltimore, but I like to say I'm from New Orleans.
You like to say you're from New Orleans?
Yes. Yeah, it's an adoptive home.
Okay. So that's where you say when you're going home, that's what you mean?
Yeah.
All right. So not a lot of ties to Baltimore anymore.
Right.
All right. So I know that you've had a good bit of schooling, and I know I've learned a lot from you just in, day-to-day conversations. You're always teaching me new things. Whether I really want to learn them or not. So, but I honestly always do. So, what did you study when you were getting your degrees?
Well, I've always been fascinated by history, and then I finally got some credentials for it. Got my BA from lovely Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana, towards the end of my sojourns around that state. But I've also spent a lot of time, I worked for state historic sites, national historic sites around the state of Louisiana, culminating in hanging out a lot around New Orleans just before I moved up to Huntsville.
So how did you actually end up in New Orleans?
By choice, eventually. Actually, when I first got to New Orleans, or when I first got to Louisiana, I didn't like New Orleans all that much. It wasn't until I had a friend move to New Orleans, and I started visiting with him, and he kind of he showed me how to New Orleans correctly.
So not just showing up for Mardi Gras and going home,
right? And just he showed a lot of layers to the town. He studied history a bit with me. Also, his main thing was anthropology and archaeology. So he found a lot of really cool stuff in that vein around town and around the area. And just kind of once I saw more of New Orleans than the tourism ads, that I kind of fell in love with it.
Okay, so you said that you worked a little bit with national parks and preservation. I remember you telling me a little bit about that. What exactly were you doing up there again?
So there's National Historical Park, Cane River Creole National Historical Park up there in northwest Louisiana that was in the middle of this little Creole enclave in what was otherwise pretty much East Texas. And the center of this enclave was a plantation that was owned by the same family for 230 years or something like that. And they just dumped it all, sold it to the Department of the Interior for $1,000 or something like that. Lock, stock, and barrel. Everything on the property, everything on the property, just an absurd amount of stuff.
Is that always an option? Can you just, whenever you want, just to sell all your property, you got a whole bunch of property? Or is Interior always willing to just buy up?
Not always, but in this case, this was what they call a bicentennial farm, which is any property owned by the same family for 200 years.
Okay.
It went back into early French colonial Louisiana, so there was obvious historical value there. Also, they had the enslaved workers and then later the sharecroppers, and so much of it was still from those people that there was an immediate draw to it there as well. There was just a lot of opportunity for research, the kind of thing they were into.
So you're basically, they had all this land and you were just going there and just finding, cool things that were there.
Right.
Okay.
And a lot of it was pretty easy to find.
Just sitting on the shelf still.
Yeah, literally. They had the Plantation Store that had opened in forget the year exactly, 1818, I want to say.
Wow.
And was the center of this whole community. It was Walmart meets it was their Amazon. Everything was there. The post office, Justice of the Peace, Tractor Supply, groceries, everything was this store. And when they closed it up, they didn't like liquidate supplies. They just closed it up and then sold it to the Department of the Interior. So
200 years later.
Yeah. So, and it kept going in through the 20th century.
Okay.
Like it ran until 1968 or so.
Okay.
But it was still just a patchwork of beginning with the really simple staple items that a plantation would have needed in the early 1800s, all the way up through the last days of this plantation as a farm.
Okay. Cool. So you said you studied mostly anthropology, or that's what you loved.
History major, anthropology minor. And I had the same guy for anthropology, Dr. Hiram Pete Gregory, taught me my entire minor. Just a brilliant guy.
Shout out, Mr. Gregory.
Yeah. And he enjoyed, he really bridged the discipline. Like that was one of the great things in retrospect that I realized about this tiny little school, that there are people in Louisiana that don't know about it,
Okay.
But there was so much interdisciplinary activity in there, like the historians talking to archaeologists, which is actually fairly rare.
You would think not, but
Right?
just as an average person.
Right. But yeah, they have it's a fascinating area, and it pound for pound, Louisiana just has so much to say about how America really developed.
Okay.
Like this little town existed as a black market. That's why the town exists. And it's hilarious to walk around this town today, and it's got, all these good Baptists walking around this town that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for a three-headed black market running from the late 18th century into American days.
So people came to New Orleans to get what they couldn't get other places.
Right. And so Natchitoches specifically was the intersection of the French Red River with the Spanish Camino Real. Spanish were road people, French were river people, but their masters didn't get along.
Okay.
So they were forbidden from a lot of trade. But in order to survive in this wilderness, they had to.
Plus you're, a couple thousand miles away from, the kings knowing,
Right.
Who's doing what. So
you had the French growing the vegetables, the Spanish with the cattle, and they would trade that. But where it really came in was the Caddo Indians. The Spanish were forbidden from trading, especially firearms, with the native population. The French, there were some of those restrictions, but they were already kind of off the reservation anyway, so they didn't particularly care about those restrictions. So they got all the really good stuff that the natives were able to make, and these guys were leatherworking wizards. So they got a lot of really good stuff that then they were able to trade with the Spanish also. But the Spanish weren't able to admit to a lot of it. So if you just look at the historical record, the Spanish governors talk about privation and want and famine and just misery. But if you go jump in the dirt, you find a lot of really cool stuff. And, kind of the knee-jerk reaction would be, well, ignore the written stuff. But no, you put the two together and you learn a lot about these people, motivations, and what they were actually doing.
And you called them the native people. What did you refer to them as?
Caddo.
Caddo.
Yeah. So that was northwest Louisiana. Now it goes. There's the Caddo can be found up in Oklahoma. But like Natchitoches is a Caddo word, and it's one of my favorite things. It is the epitome of Creole because it is the American pronunciation of the American pronunciation of the French spelling of the Spanish rendering of a Caddo word.
And that kind of brings us to why, you said you love New Orleans so much, not just from living there, but as a city as itself, because you feel like it really represents kind of America as a whole, because it's just such a conglomerate of every single different country coming together and working together and actually, making it work.
Right. And they didn't do it just, it wasn't just this utopian hand-holding. There was plenty of struggle, fighting through arguments and intentions and things like that. But the outcome was this wonderful, dirty, fantastic city. That people, that's maintained the same kind of soul, same kind of set core for 300 years now, regardless of all these massive influxes from all over the world.
Yeah. So you said that it's been growing a lot. Is it still growing? I know that after the Katrina incident there, that I assume that there would be probably a little bit of harder times now.
There was a major evacuation. There's still plenty of a New Orleans diaspora all over the place. Especially like Houston became 20% New Orleans in 2006, and a lot of them haven't made their way back, but there's a significant amount that have. And the new immigration problem that New Orleans has is something they haven't really dealt with in quite some time, which is wealthy people. People of means. That hasn't really been a thing since the early American days.
So back when those people on that plantation we were talking about earlier that you were working on,
right,
would be the last time that we had a lot of wealthy people there, where they owned all this land,
right,
and now they're selling it off, and now they have this influx of
and there's some pushback from the locals. I hesitate to call them natives. Not sure if there's such a thing as in the New Orleans, but because they're kind of changing the face of it, but it's to what they think the face is. It's a new version of the same issue that they've had, at least for as long as it's been an American city.
Yeah. So the fact that you said that, like, you don't like to call people that live there, necessarily natives. That's always a thing that I've always thought about is people call you a native to this place or that place, but if you say that my heritage is from Germany or from Ireland or that kind of stuff, it only always goes back so far.
Right.
So everybody has always moved from somewhere, and if you say that I am German, they only lived in Germany for so long before they came to America. So when people ask me, I just say I'm here. Like, what are you doing? I'm here.
Right. Present.
So I'm right now when I'm in America. So I guess.
I can especially relate to this because I moved so much that like New Orleans was the first place I ever even called home. Like I didn't have a concept of that. So the reason I learned as much, and I'm still somewhat obsessed with Baltimore, is that's where my dad grew up. So those were the stories I heard. So that was kind of where I considered Sheehan Central, because after that we moved every 2 or 3 years for most of my life, sometimes less. So I didn't really have that concept of a home of where I'm from until there was somewhere I wanted to be from.
Oh. Okay, so you said we wanted to talk a little bit about you mentioned the immigration, moving a recent influx of the wealthy people into New Orleans. We wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of where all immigration started from. Obviously America is a country of immigrants, and you've talked to me a little bit about that, and some interesting topics and ideas about where it all started from, where we are going with it today, and that kind of stuff. So.
Right, and most importantly, how we've dealt with it before, how Americans have viewed it before.
How do you think that we have dealt with it in the past?
Getting used to it, that there is so much more movement now, just generally speaking, in the States than there has been, and it is just a matter of scale. Like, when do you think the United States got to 100 million people as a population?
When do I think?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe 1800.
1918. 135 years after running the British out of Yorktown. Took us 135 years to get to 100 million. When did we hit 200 million?
Well, okay, if we were in what was it again?
1918. So 135 years to get to 100 million.
All right. See, I said 1800, and you gave me a face, so I went too low. Apparently, I didn't pay attention.
How long did it take us to get our second 100 million?
Second 100 million, I'm going to guess maybe another 15 years.
35. So 1953.
Okay, a little bit longer.
300 million took us another 27 years. So that 135 to get to 100 million. 70 years later, we were at 300 million.
Wow.
Just exponential growth that nobody saw coming. And I still don't think our infrastructure was ready for it or has really thoroughly adjusted to it. But so the number of people expanded exponentially. The ability for these people to move around expanded exponentially, and to do so kind of voluntarily, because there had been migrant populations around the U.S. since before there was a U.S., but now it's seeking better opportunities rather than there's absolutely nothing here, I'm going to go somewhere else. Improving your lot rather than hoping to find one. And this massive exponential increase in population also has affected how we deal with people crossing that big border in a lot of ways. Because for that first 140 years, the federal government didn't really care about immigration. That was the state's problem. That was that individual city's problem. And for a lot of cities, it was a problem. And I'm going to go back to New Orleans a lot because that's my that's my area of expertise, such as it is. So it became American around 1814, and it became a work depot. It was known, at least across the Atlantic, as they wanted to do a lot of internal improvements. And this really, Europe was kind of busy with the whole Napoleon thing still. But once that ended, especially for the Irish, we had a influx of people looking for work in New Orleans. New Orleans still hadn't adjusted to being American yet. So you have Irish and German and Italian just pouring in, and they haven't kind of figured themselves out yet. And that made a very precarious situation. And the way they became integrated into the population was initially as kind of a slur was the Irish vote. That, and stop me when this sounds familiar, that they'll hijack our elections.
Oh, I'll stop you there.
So that's whatever. And at first, the parties of the day, neither of them really wanted the Irish vote. But then Andrew Jackson started to run for president, and he decided we'll take them. And that's when the Irish kind of started to become an Irish community.
Well, to vote all the same. So, and obviously he saw that, and we see that today when people are appealing to different nationalities and that kind of stuff, to where he obviously knew that he could probably end up winning if he just showed a little bit of interest in these people. So,
one of my favorite things to do is to look at all of the newspapers. The Library of Congress has done a spectacular job of chronicling and digitizing a lot of 19th century newspapers around the country. And like New Orleans in the 1840s had over a dozen newspapers. And they had conversations with each other.
The newspapers had conversations with other newspapers?
Yeah. So
in what way?
You would, there was no assumption of objectivity for them. So, you would see something like, our friends at the Gazette said in their issue of the whatever date.
And then the next paper's like, no, we didn't.
Right. And so it's this back and forth, and it really came to a head during this Jacksonian period. One of the things I came across was John Randolph of Roanoke, a proper bona fide founder, right? Said something on the floor of the Senate, the United States Senate, that referring to the Irish as the pitiful Lazzaroni of Ireland vomited forth upon our shores. And yes, it may be humanity to take them in, but he would make it death to do so.
Wow.
And all this just obviously, spiteful rhetoric. And then my favorite part is the next issue when he tries to take it all back. That was all out of context.
Oh, yeah.
And then he tried to get the press ejected from the Senate.
I actually thought that was kind of more of a recent thing where you were able to go back and apologize for something you clearly said.
Right?
I didn't realize that that went back so far.
It's in the finest tradition of American politics.
Oh. Well, that's comforting to know.
All the way back to a guy that signed the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, okay.
But this also gives you an idea of how, of what the conversation was about immigration in 1828. It was very similar. There was the one group that was happy to, take all comers. And then there was the other that wanted just to close it down. And, what's funny there is just the fact that they thought it was a problem in 1828. This was 15 years before the Great Famine. The numbers shot up unbelievably. As many as came in the 1820s and 30s, 200 to 300% more came in the 1840s, and hit crisis levels. And so you saw this situation of people, like at that plantation I worked, the national park, they had grown up speaking French. Like that, this place was entirely French.
Here in America,
yeah,
they were okay.
In Northwest Louisiana, speaking French, learning French, and then they grow up, and in the late 1840s and early 1850s, they joined the Know Nothing Party, the American Party, which was America First, which was very one of their primary tenets was to close off immigration. We're full up. So they thought in 1850. And so the idea of native changed.
I wonder how long you, even all the way back then, how long you had to be here before you were able to start saying, nah, no more people. It's like, was it 5 years? 5 years you've been here and you're like, all right, well, I've been here for 5 years and that person, he can't come in.
Right.
So
this is maybe the third generation of his family. The first generation in American Louisiana, deciding we're done here.
Oh.
So it's the opinion of Americans has always been the same towards immigrants. They were worried about the same things that people that worry about immigration now have in mind, jobs, political upheaval, hijacking politics. That's a major worry, right? Because it's, running so smoothly. And hijacking the culture. Because, even though New Orleans was better suited to receive a bunch of Irish Catholics, the rest of America, not so much. And they were concerned about what all these papists would do to our common American morals. And it's just slightly different terms for exactly the same buzzwords we have now. And it was a major issue, and always has been. And the way it's just a matter of what the immigrants wound up doing is just waiting it out, making themselves not as much useful as almost not thought of, just the almost like furniture.
Okay, yeah, they're just trying to be in the background so that, if as long as they're not doing anything that's noticing, they're getting noticed, that, they can just hopefully wait it out until the next group comes along and we start disliking them. Right. And,
and then we can join in.
Yeah.
And that's actually what the Irish did, sadly, to a large extent. So Jackson was a Democrat. And then, so they all became Democrats because that's how they were able to integrate themselves, to get some political power, was these guys were offering them votes. Cool. But then the Democrats changed after Jackson, or their focus changed. You got to Calhoun and, the compromises over slavery and gag rules and things like that, and that became the point of the Democrats, and that's kind of a large degree of how the Irish became white, because they were immigrants, and that was the point. They were Catholics, and that was the point. But then once they started kind of campaigning for what their party was proud of at the time, then they became actually accepted and even celebrated. But what's really great is how they got into positions of authority. Mm-hmm. And was through the police. And
so they started working in the police first.
Right.
And then slowly worked their way up.
That's how they eventually became mayors and things like that.
Okay.
Was because at first the early idea of the Irish immigrant was a digger. Those internal improvements in the 1820s, digging out canals, backbreaking, really dangerous work that they were all happy to do. And it just kept being jobs other people didn't want to do. And one of those was police. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Like, one of the funnier images of, well, funny in retrospect, probably terrifying at the time, is private fire brigades, and brawls and riots would break out over who gets to fight this particular fire.
Really?
Yeah.
That was a thing.
Yeah.
So we didn't. This was not a taxpayer.
Right.
Tax paid thing going on. We actually just had people that just wanted to fight fires.
The fire brigade. That's what they did.
So would they go there? Would they put out your fire and then stick their hand out and ask for some money?
Yes.
Guessing that they saved your money from the fire.
Assuming, yeah.
And if they didn't, then so wow. There's pictures of men fighting in front of fires.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be more like cuttings rather than pictures, but yes, there are descriptions in newspapers of the day of firefighters fighting firefighters.
Firefighters fighting fires.
Yeah.
Fighters. Okay. That's amazing.
But that's how they got themselves, how they became integral parts of the town, was doing jobs like that. And as those the municipal governments evolved, so did their positions that they were already in. And that gained more power, that gained more prestige, and they became just accepted, especially after the Civil War. And that's when, the federal government started getting involved in immigration, and they weren't worried about Irish anymore.
So Irish people really were our first time that we ever were really worried about immigration. Were they the first?
Yeah, I mean, it's in that scale, absolutely.
All over the country we were worried about Irish immigrants.
Because, most of the people that think of Irish immigration don't think of New Orleans. You think of New York and Boston, places like that.
Seemed like the easier place to get to from Ireland.
Which it actually wasn't.
Oh.
The way they got to New Orleans was because of the cotton trade.
Oh.
So a major cotton trading partner was the British, and they had the north of Britain at the time was so much textile mills. That was their main thing, and so they would get a lot of the cotton from the south, particularly from Savannah and New Orleans. So these ships would be laden down with cotton, get over there, and need ballast. And Ireland was in a recession, and people were looking to get out. And so the way they got out was by serving as ballast.
Okay.
For these ships on the way back, just dump them out on the piers, wish them luck, and fill up with cotton again. They called them coffin ships.
Why were they called coffin ships?
Well, first off, a ballast hold is not a pleasant place to.
Okay, hold on. What exactly is ballasting?
It's what holds what holds the ship's position. Prevents it from rolling too much, and can affect the steerage of the old sailing ships.
Oh, okay.
So it's just weighting down that ship.
That's all they needed was weight.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so this was not only a way to get ballast, but also to get a little bit of a fare from them.
Oh, they were paying. Okay.
Yeah. And it was relative to the day, nothing.
A couple potatoes.
From Liverpool to New Orleans, or Savannah, or wherever.
So they had already immigrated over to at least England.
Well, and Liverpool was an easy place to get to from Ireland.
Yeah. Just a swim.
Right. Not quite, but yes, essentially, relatively speaking, to hanging out in Ireland. They'd make that little bit of a hop across the pond to Liverpool, then get on these ships and make their way to the new American city of New Orleans, and start digging ditches there. And what wound up happening was the people that hopped out of those ballast holds then wound up being the people that would fill them back up with cotton.
Oh.
So it was this weird lower class kind of horizontal monopoly.
But they wouldn't need the ballast on the way back because they had all the cotton.
Because of the cotton, yeah.
Okay.
And they were crazy with that stuff. There were these guys called screwmen, and they would have these yard-long metal screws. And you would twist the screw that would compact the cotton bales, get to squeeze as much cotton into these things as possible. And they did it so tightly that in some cases the cotton said no and just sprang back to its original size. And you don't want to be in that hold when that happens. So there was one of the most dangerous jobs in America in 1825.
That's a way to go, to get squashed by cotton.
And so they could make a relatively decent living until they died of it. But yeah, so cotton that way, Irish this way. And it became this thing called the Irish Channel in New Orleans. Almost like it was almost a ghettoizing of the Irish in New Orleans. But it was that community that they built up that way that was able to receive all the famine refugees 25 years later. And ultimately, like, you know, one of the main things that came out of the city was so much better for it in the long run, because the things that came out of it were St. Patrick's Church in New Orleans, which was again a very different situation than the Irish met in a lot of other American cities that weren't so much Catholic and didn't really have that background, except Baltimore, oddly enough.
Bringing it back to Baltimore.
There's actually been a weird little intercourse between Baltimore and New Orleans for the last 250 years.
All the way up until you.
Pretty much, yeah. And beyond. But St. Patrick's was, you know, the Irish population became prominent enough that they actually got their own parish and their parish church, and it became the center of that community. Even once the Irish Channel became not so much Irish, you know, even when the Germans and Italians started moving into it later on in the century, St. Patrick's Church was still the center of that community. The first statue of a woman in the United States is a statue of an Irish woman in New Orleans.
Oh, wow. When was that erected?
Must have been the 1850s. I can't think of the year offhand. But she was a baker's wife that wound up inheriting his bakery after his death and turned it into an orphanage.
Oh, wow.
And she became just kind of the patron saint of a lot of dispossessed people around.
Got it right there. Oh, that's when she passed away. Margaret
Hoffrey.
Okay. Oh.
But wow. It became very important to the sort of dispossessed around New Orleans.
So this is when they started becoming, you said, eventually they were praised and, you know, happy that they were there.
Right.
So this is later on into that.
Yeah, and usually it takes a common enemy to move on to the next one.
And who was this next common enemy?
Well, first it was the slaves. That's how the Irish kind of ingratiated themselves to the solid South in the 1850s. Was this calling for the renewal of the transatlantic slave trade and things like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, but that was, again, just slogans that gave them a sense of power. And then after the war, when the federal government started getting interested in immigration, their first order of business was to stop the Chinese from coming to California. And that became the rallying cry of the nativists around America. Was, I guess we stole it first. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely.
Although we sort of stole it third out there. But anyway. Yeah, so that the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1870s. And by that time, the Irish influx had died down considerably.
And you said that that this was the first time that the federal government had actually stepped in. Right. Was during the end of the Irish immigration.
That's just a coincidental thing. Yeah. So by the time Irish immigration had calmed down, then we had a lot of Americans moving out west, especially in the years following the Civil War. And so we had the Chinese coming from across the Pacific, and then Americans moving into their property out there in California. And, that led to a lot of tension out there, and ultimately the passing of Exclusion Acts that initially just said, no more Chinese.
That was the first exclusion.
Yeah.
Oh.
But they still didn't do much. Like, it'd show up every 15, 20 years and either relax a previous act or exclude a new bunch. And this was all the way up into World War II era. Just stayed on that kind of clock. Getting up to Coolidge in 1924. Another, we're full up, we're done. And eventually that was relaxed into quotas. Each country we could allow so many from each country, and that's still a thing today.
Yeah. I feel like, you once, it's like they all moved to one central area, and then, once they spread out and they got a little bit more land, then we're like, oh, well, maybe we still do have a little bit more land here, and maybe a little bit more resources. And I feel like that's probably why, after just a couple of years, they do come to that conclusion of, oh, well, maybe we can let a couple more people in, because there is still a lot of land here. I mean,
absolutely,
even just where we're from, you can drive for a couple hours south and see nothing but cows. There's just plenty of farmland, and
drive down I-59 in Mississippi, all you see is trees.
Yeah,
you hear the rumor of towns.
Let's keep those trees, though. Let's keep the trees. Let's start at the grasslands first, and then maybe we'll move to cutting down trees. Hopefully we'll keep those up for a little while. We need those a little bit.
But yeah, and it's an interesting thing though that the tension we have now is the reason we think we have immigration. Kind of the driving force behind the immigration we allow is what the argument is now. Whether it's people that can afford it, people that before they arrive are able to quantifiably improve our situation, whether it be through just skills or education, or things like that, or what we've had for as long as the government, almost as long as the government's been involved, has been the primary objective has been keeping families together.
That makes sense.
Because a lot of our another reason that the feds weren't so interested in immigration for a long time is the concept of birds of flight, that people would come over here, gather up a little bit of stash of money, and then go home.
That's usually not the case, though.
Right. It was for a while.
Oh, okay.
That was the idea for a while, or that was the assumption. Of course, this was during a time when it was a lot easier to, just hop a riverboat and disappear somewhere in the wilderness. Yeah. I'm not staying that long. Where you can find me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But so went from that to keeping families together, which is arguable as a motive force, or at least from our perspective, to now what we're trying to focus on, being people that can immediately, obviously contribute.
Okay.
And the issue is, because, even like Britain, a place like that, has a quota. There, once we've given out so many visas to people from the UK, that's it. And as we get as restrictions get stronger, as penalties get stricter, we're going to wind up in a very new situation of alienating the people we're trying to attract.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. The fact that you said that, how we can afford, we'll take in people that can afford to move over. It's not very cheap. I've just for fun looked at what what it would take to move to Canada, and it is hard. It's not easy. Okay. You have to get, work visas, and you have to stay there for a certain amount of time. It's not just like, yeah, I got $5,000 to buy my citizenship. I'm just going to come on over. It's complicated. It's very hard. And, especially, just in Canada's case, I haven't looked at many other countries, what it would take to move there, but, it's pretty hard.
To say nothing of like renouncing citizenship. Have you seen anything about that?
I have not, no.
The fees to renounce citizenship have increased. They've at least double every 4 years or so.
Just for is that everywhere?
For renouncing U.S. citizenship.
Okay.
Because, as it is.
You can pay to renounce your citizenship?
Yes.
Do you have to leave if you renounce your citizenship?
Yes.
So
yeah,
you can't just claim a sovereign state,
right?
Some
people
house.
tried that a few years ago. It didn't work well. Didn't end well.
Where did they get deported to? What happened to them?
I'm talking about about 150 years ago.
Oh, okay, okay.
But yeah, so the people that say if you don't like it, leave. Well, you got $30,000.
Yeah, it's hard.
And that is a thing that it's a call that has rung down the centuries of American practical politics. But it's also so wrong-headed in so many different kinds of ways.
So right now it's not too much. You can renounce your citizenship for $2,350. I mean, that's still a chunk of change. But, I don't know why, if you're going to go to another country, and live there, I feel like dual citizenship is, wouldn't be too bad. I mean,
but
what?
Why would they make it this hard? Why would they make it that difficult to renounce citizenship? What do they get out of your maintaining citizenship?
Money.
Yeah. That's what they're concerned about.
Is losing my tax paying, how much I pay in taxes every single year.
Right.
Which is more than $2,300. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is.
But even if I'm in a different country and I'm earning money in a different country, how does that play into if I still have citizenship here? Do I have to pay for that citizenship if I'm somewhere else, living somewhere else?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
if you are a U.S. national, that they expect you to keep those cards and letters coming in.
Oh, so they're asking for taxes even when I'm making money somewhere else and spending my money somewhere else. Okay.
Yep.
Huh. Well, it's not as much as I thought it was going to be. I mean, you said it was, doubling and tripling. I was thinking like, I don't know, $10,000.
Well, there was a time when it was nothing. I mean, not literally nothing. There's always going to be some kind of fees for
$5, something like that.
Right. For shipping and handling. But that is so much more than it was even 20 years ago.
Okay.
And they keep just arbitrarily raising it. Like, no.
That's probably something that doesn't make the headlines very often either.
Not much. No.
Yeah.
Which is kind of ironic considering how much you hear. If you don't like it, leave.
Yeah.
Right? And here's the process for leaving. Yeah.
That's something. That's something else. So if I do move to a different country and I decide that I don't care about denouncing my citizenship, I'm never going back. What does it matter to me? I wonder what the repercussions are of me never paying any more taxes or trying to keep my citizenship or never denouncing it or anything.
Right. I would expect in those cases, you want to be aware of the extradition treaties.
That's true. Okay. Yeah.
Because if we're not worried about expenses, then they're definitely not worried about the expense of bringing you back.
Which is probably more than $2,000, you'd think.
Yeah. But we're not about the money. We're about the principle.
Okay. So,
So the situation with immigration is, on the kind of micro scale, has pretty much always been the same in American history. Can't really speak to any others, but the what has changed has been the scale. Not even necessarily the as far as the numbers coming in, but what those numbers meant once they got here. It made, in the early 19th century, so much of what is now America wasn't. And especially in a place like New Orleans, you didn't necessarily stop there, particularly if you could avoid stopping there and, just make your way into the interior and just find your fortune that way. That was a decision a lot of people made, but those that didn't have that ability to make the decision are the ones that I think have the most in common with the present crisis. Is the refugees, because that is most certainly what they were, and that's what we see decried across the globe now. There's a migrant crisis in Europe that's breaking up European governments, not breaking them up so much as changing their faces.
Yeah.
And it's the same cries we've heard for hundreds of years. And it's just a matter of, I think, of when we say something like, if you don't like it, leave, the fantastic thing about America is, first off, you can leave where you are. There is still significant freedom of movement. It still ain't cheap, but there is still that possibility. And there are so many places to go. And this just leads to what is, what do we value? What are our common American morals? Insofar as they can exist. And it should be the idea that there is, you've heard the phrase "two Americas." Have you?
No, I haven't.
Ever heard that used? It was especially a thing in the recent elections. The two Americas of red and blue. But there's no such thing as two Americas. There are millions of Americas interacting hundreds of times every day, and generally for mutual benefit.
What do you mean by that? By millions of Americas?
That the basic unit of measurement in America has been the individual. And it's been a struggle, but the point has been coexistence. The point has been, the French and Spanish and Natchitoches trying to figure out how to make it out in the wilderness, rather than, following along with their political masters in shunning and ignoring and hating the other. They
just work together.
Yeah.
To get along.
Right.
Yeah, I can definitely see where, it's always just a problem, and not necessarily a problem, but always something that's talked about as a problem, and how we always end up making it work out. And I guess we could get to a point where there isn't always a easy solution, but I think that there always can be a solution, and it's just kind of once somebody's here, and if they can't go back home to at least a safe place, it's kind of just having to figure out what to do now. And like you said, if it's when they don't have anything obvious of worth to bring to the table immediately, it's like you're just shunned and taken away. It's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. And it's a question of what kind of nation do you want to be? How do you want to be seen? What kind of people do you want to be? And the way the Irish in New Orleans made it was by a community willing to take them in, and that is another fantastic common theme in American history, that regardless of what the newspaper headlines said and regardless of what the political slogans were, there has always been a community willing to take them in. And as long as that keeps going, and one of the significant challenges now is we don't really have the freedom to do that. Anyone that is interested in taking them in can't. The treatment of them is so symbolic now, rather than humane or on the individual level, that even those that might be inclined towards such charity and even to the point of self-sacrifice don't really have the ability to do so, and get turned away, and that's a definite change.
Yeah, it's like you could get possibly charged for like harboring a fugitive or that kind of stuff. Like if I just wanted to take in some illegal Switzerland people, and they wanted to come over, and they heard the ski slopes were great here, and they wanted to get their ski on, so they came here, and
their visa expired or something like that. Yeah,
and they never had one in the first place.
Well,
they came over on a barge in a shipping container that was modified, and I wanted to take them in and say, you guys don't have enough money to go home, and you got done skiing, and now they decided they wanted to stay, and I could, if I took them in, had enough money to pay for all of them, and just took care of them, and eventually they ended up contributing well to society, I could still get in trouble.
Yeah.
No matter how much it ended up maybe in the end game positively impacting my small town or my area, it wouldn't matter, and I could get charged, and that just scales up.
Right.
So it's like if a town here in America wants to open their borders and say anybody can come in and anybody can do it, at a federal level, it can still be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and it's weird to live in one of these kind of hinges of history. Seeing how we're the new criteria affecting an old issue, and how we're going to ultimately. And I guess not ultimately, but immediately deal with it, handle it. It's important, and it's kind of scary. Like this is the kind of thing I would rather study than experience.
Yeah.
But I've got a weird optimism about it.
Me too. I don't think it's weird. I think it's good. I think that you should try to stay positive about it, and it's like it's not an easy solution, and there isn't just one answer for any of this. It just it just takes time. You know, how long did it take for, you said that when they first started coming over, it was, you know, around that, you said that it was around 18, you know, 1815, 1810.
Right. So there was an old Irish before New Orleans became an American city. The major times of Irish immigration, 1820 to 1835-ish, was a major, what was considered a major flood of Irish to our shores. But then there were the famine,
and then it took another, you know, 100 years, and then we elect an Irish Catholic president.
Right.
So, you know, and, you know, some people see him as, you know, one of our best presidents, you know, and, you know, or at least very inspirational, at least got us to the moon. And so it just takes a little bit of time and ends up, you know, positively impacting, you know, America as a whole.
And that tends to be the story with immigrants in America. You know, virtually any nationality that had a major influx to America has a similar story of being unwanted and considered the unwashed horde when they first arrive, and then ultimately being, you know, mayor and president. That tends to be how it goes, and so the most disturbing thing to me is the fact that people think all this stuff is new.
Mm-hmm.
That we've never dealt with it before. That, you know, it's an unprecedented problem. When you can, it doesn't take a lot to see what's happened similarly in the past, how we've dealt with it, and how we've profited from it.
Yeah.
Because that's all it's, you know, no, we're not going to find the perfect people to come in, but you can't guarantee outcome, but you can guarantee opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Well, yeah, definitely. I like that. So I feel like I've learned a good bit about all this. I feel like, yeah, definitely how it's never been a new thing. It's always been a thing. America is a country of immigrants. We have, you know, very few Native Americans left. Don't call them Indians.
Funny story about that. My anthropological studies led me to deal with a lot of Indian people around Louisiana, and particularly like Tunica, Biloxi, and Caddo. And so I was kind of walking on eggshells the first time I was at one of these. We called it basket days, where the crafts for people from one of the nearby tribes would come through and sell off their crafts at the university. And I said something about Native Americans, and they said, "Oh, no, white man, you don't get to make yourself feel better. You can call us Indians."
Oh, wow, really? That's surprising to me. Because that's something I'm always frustrated with. I guess, you know, maybe I don't feel like I'm trying to make myself feel better. It's just confusing to me. It's honestly just confusing. Because if somebody says, you know, Indian American,
right,
it's somebody from India. But if I say American Indian, it's
you don't picture an American person in like Delhi or something like that.
Yeah, it's and even when I was in DC recently, they had they I feel like it's a kind of a newer museum where it was the Indian American Museum or the Native American Indian Museum, and we all call it that. I even had a, you know, history teacher that would say that very, very smart dude, very, you know, politically correct with a lot of things, but he said, you know, we're going to talk about Native Americans just to make it easier, we're just going to say Indian. And man, does that get confusing, because even just now when you said I felt like you were walking on eggshells and you said Native American, and they said that when you said when I was with Indian people, I thought you were going with, I was with people from India. So it's like, I wish we could all get on the same page from here. We knew we weren't in India. I know that maybe they feel like we're trying to make ourselves feel better. I feel like it's just less confusing, and let's just stop calling them Indians. Goodness sakes. Like we have people from India here. If we didn't have people from India living here, I probably wouldn't care. But it's just confusing. And
I don't think American Indian is much better, like as far as clearing things up.
No,
like we said,
Indian American gives you a picture in your head, but American Indian gives you another picture. Ooh, all right.
Completely unrelated too. But yeah, it's jumped down a little rabbit hole for a second there.
Yeah, no, totally. I've just had that on my heart for a while, and I just needed to get it off. So I've been wanting to say that. So yeah. Anyway, back to.
But as may be evident, I am for immigration at all times. What I can't stand about the borders we get used to is that they don't exist for any particular reason.
Yeah.
That we can really quantify.
You mean like state borders?
Yeah.
County borders?
We had nothing to do with them.
At least the people living today.
Right.
Yeah.
There's that entire series of how the states were made, or how the states got their shapes, or something like
mostly
that.
Rivers, right? If it's not a river, it's a straight line.
And it just I prefer things kind of organic.
Yeah.
And the lines we have now, and that we're so inclined to so staunchly defend, are arbitrary.
Mm.
In so many ways. It's just I think it's a strange measure, a strange kind of unit of measurement to base a worldview on, I don't think that there's this guy Stephen Davies. He's a historian that works at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, and I saw him give a talk once on. He said something to the effect of, "America is not 50 states. You've been raised to believe it is, but it's not. It is instead 230 socioeconomic zones. These are the areas where you're able to, where you really leave a mark." Just by being there, just by by existing day to day there, and they have very little in common. The Gulf Coast cities have more in common than other cities further inland in those same states, right?
Yeah. Well, it's just like our Florida coast, how it comes in with like next to Alabama, and then like those cities are right next to each other, but there's just some rocks separating them there at the coast, and other than some rocks separating them, there's not much of a difference between those two cities at all, other than, like we said, taxes and who your governor is, that kind of stuff,
right. And so you have this weird sense of it sets up a very arbitrary idea of governance that I think is kind of pervasive, and always has been, I suppose. But again, it's not a matter of kind; it's a matter of scale, of what you can consider mine, what you can consider ours.
Yeah.
Has less to do with the people and more to do with these arbitrarily defined lines.
Yeah. Because most of the time, at least here in the U.S., where you meet somebody from a different state, you normally can't tell much of a difference between you and the other person. You're pretty much all the same. So, our cultures are very, very similar, and that kind of stuff. You said something before we started filming about Memphis and about how
Memphis is my favorite example of this idea of states are just in the way. Memphis falls into 3 states. You've got the Memphis of Tennessee, then you've got West Memphis in Arkansas, and then you got places like Mount Olive, Mississippi. And if somebody from any of that area was traveling somewhere and someone asked where they were from, unless they were just doggedly determined to be from Mississippi rather than think someone was, have someone think they were from Tennessee, they'd tell you Memphis. I've had people back to New Orleans. I've had people from like Bay St. Louis and in Mississippi say they were from New Orleans. And it's not until you say, oh, yeah, me too, that they start to get a little more specific, because that is where they spend their money. That is where they have their jobs. That's where they have their lives. Memphis is the big city. That is kind of the center of their orbit. And those state lines just are for these arbitrary things, not necessarily for their livelihoods. And in a way, they sort of just get in the way of their socio-economic area there.
So I wonder what those 230 zones were, if he actually was just like coming up with that number.
He had a map.
Oh, he had a map.
Yeah.
Probably around every like major city and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and major city. One of the places I lived in Louisiana.
230 is a lot, so yeah.
One of the places I lived in Louisiana was in northeast Louisiana. Like 3 of the poorest counties in the United States are in northeast Louisiana. So there's not
the 3 poorest or 3 of the poorest?
When I lived there, they were 3 of the bottom 10.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At least 2 of them are definitely still there. But so there wasn't a significant population center per se, but for the area, it was Monroe, or as the locals said, Monroe. And we had some family coming down from D.C. to visit us. And we tell them, my parents are giving them directions. Okay, you'll go get on I-20 for what feels like your entire life, and you'll get to the big city around here, Monroe, and you'll find 165 and blah, 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 blah. They call us from Texas.
They missed
the entire state of Louisiana because they drove through everywhere and they didn't see a city.
Oh.
So they just kept going. But for the people in northeast Louisiana, Monroe is the hub.
You got a diner and a gas station.
It had a mall, I'll have you know, and 2 movie theaters.
My bad, sorry. I underestimated.
But that was the center of that place, of that part of that state. And that's, even kind of reached over into Arkansas, because I have no idea what the nearest population center. There was a time we lived in a place where we used to joke that we lived in Louisiana, our dog lived in Arkansas. And Monroe was still it. But yeah, so when you say big cities, that's a very relative term.
Okay, so 230 socioeconomic zones.
Right.
That it really is the United States, where most of the people make their money, most of the people spend their money, and all that relates back to the immigrants. And how exactly?
Well, just that when people are telling you if you don't like it, leave, and things like that, when people are trying to keep someone out, the motivation tends to be that arbitrary.
Those lines.
Yeah.
Okay. And those lines really don't matter when it comes down to, where we actually are as a country with all those 230 areas
right.
of. Okay.
And, another modern challenge, contemporary challenge, is we still have these zones, but we also have eyes around the world.
Yes, with the internet.
Right. And, that this is definitely a modern issue. Something that nothing I've talked about from the 1820s can really touch, is the concept of local and global. Has not been, that hasn't really been in the lexicon until very recently. And it's a new challenge, because there is maintaining, I guess, balance between the concept of home, the concept of kind of your sphere of influence, and maximizing your ability to reach further, and what effect the one has on the other, and that kind of throws significant wrinkles into the concept, or into the issue, the ever-present issue of immigration, and its motivations and its welcome.
Yeah, I feel like it probably helps with also just kind of figuring out like where, the best places to go and to migrate to. Like I feel like that's probably a Googled thing is like what country is best to migrate to, or to move to. And it makes me wonder how, when we went all the way back to the Irish people coming in, how exactly they knew that it was going to be a better situation than where they were at, other than maybe a couple people going and coming back and saying, yeah, it was pretty great there.
Well, for that time, that's a fairly simple answer, in that the exchange between Southern planters and English textile barons was so constant and ingrained, even by that, even that early, that especially when it's found out that New Orleans has become American, that was a huge deal. Because they had these ideas of municipal internal improvements. Since that they hadn't really, it was a new thing for America too, to take over a city that was already there for a century. And so it like I said, it developed the reputation of being a work depot, and I think that's a pretty easy analogy to today, and the reason people make their way here a lot of the time. But yeah, I guess the Google would have been the ship owners saying, "Go to New Orleans, hop in the hold."
Yeah,
I
feel like and if you're not necessarily like a ship holder or a person that was going and getting the textiles and bringing them back, and so there was a like constant talk between those guys. But you just hear about your Irish brother who's just like, oh well, he left and he didn't come back, so I'm guessing either it went really well or it didn't go great, and things aren't going great here. So I guess I'll hop on that train too, or
right,
boat in this sense, but
proverbial train.
Yes, proverbial train. So yeah. Well, I feel like we kind of covered everything we want to talk about. Was there anything else that you kind of wanted to get into?
Oh, not particularly. I think we've pretty well. This is not a discussion that's ever going to end. If there's anything that the study of American immigration tells you, it's someone's going to have a very similar conversation in another 100 years.
Yeah.
Maybe
it'll be like people moving back from Mars because
right.
They're sick of the Martian government.
Right. Yeah.
Just a bunch of darn scientists and
Deimos first.
Yeah. So it'll probably, like you said, just always be a conversation that goes on. And I think kind of just learning about, where we've stood in the past and, where we're going. It kind of shows us where we're going to go and where we're going right now and how this is not a new thing. And just we've been able to overcome it in the past. And like you said, eventually profit off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and, you can turn what seems like a bad situation into something good as long as, you keep people happy and keep them moving and keep them doing things.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that's the lesson to learn here today.
Absolutely. And it's always a matter of choice. Like, and what one fantastic thing is, the choice is not limited by popular opinion. I guess that's kind of the blessing, the double-edged sword of popular opinion, is that you can still have the impact that you would prefer, regardless of the kind of prevailing opinions. And there are so many, and there are that it is exciting and scary, but again, I maintain optimism.
I think that's all you can do is, maintain optimism and, just keep a positive outlook and, realize that we'll get through it and we'll figure it out and hopefully just make the world a better place as a whole.
That's the idea.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Nathan.
Appreciate you having me.
Glad everything we talked about and really opened my eyes a little bit more.